Now that we've gone through the players in the ecosystem, as well as provide some definitions, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into our key ocean freight participants, starting with steamship lines. We've mentioned this on a couple of occasions, but let's formalize the discussion by saying that steamship lines specialize in the containerized transport of goods. As we see in our image, these are container ships, also known as ocean carriers. Steamship lines, ocean carriers, vessel operating common carriers. These are all synonymous terms that we're going to continue to use interchangeably. As we said, but we'll state again as a reminder in our second bullet, the FMC definition of a steamship line, an ocean carrier, basically, is a vessel operating common carrier that specializes in the transport of containerized cargo. Also mentioned previously, through a liner service, steamship lines offer scheduled routes and sailing dates. Just like an airline will have scheduled flights from one city to the next, steamship lines offer scheduled routes and sailing dates, those port piers that we alluded to some time back. Also related to steamship lines, they work closely with port operators, terminal operators, those MTOs we've mentioned, ocean freight forwarders, rail companies, intermodal companies, drayage firms, and long-haul truckers to carry out their service offering. This bullet helps to illustrate the importance of integrating the maritime supply chain and all the different players in addition to the steamship lines that complete the service offering. Steamship lines don't just offer port-to-port service. They depend on others to complete the entire inbound logistics chain, but sometimes offer services themselves above and beyond port-to-port services. We'll talk more about that in just a little while. Second bullet, container lines can contract directly with shippers or with NVOCCs, who, as we've said, in turn offer multiple services to shippers. It's very common for a steamship line to contract for space on their ships directly with large U.S. importers. Those container lines also contract with NVOCCs, so those NVOCCs can turn around and sell space as well as additional services above and beyond space on those ships. As a trade tip, some container lines have their own logistics divisions that compete with freight forwarders. We'll see this again in a supply chain perspective, but the container lines have moved over the last 20 to 30 years from offering just CY to CY service, container yard to container yard service, port to port basically, to offer these other additional services. So whereas the container lines will sell space on their ships to NVOCCs, they'll also compete with those NVOCCs in these other service areas. To provide a little perspective on how steamship lines and the size of ships have grown, let's check out the next couple of slides. In 1976, the largest container ships carried 1,500 TEU, what are referred to as 20-foot equivalency units. These aren't just 20-foot containers. They can be 40-footers, 40 high cube containers. It's the equivalent of a 20-foot container that is used as the unit of measure on container ships, TEUs as they're called. The largest ones carried 1,500. Today, the largest ships can carry over 20,000 TEU and continue to grow in capacity. A normal container ship, as we see in the last bullet here, not unusual at all to see container ships carrying 10,000 TEU. In fact, the more common sized ship is right around 14,000 TEU. These are big vessels. Let's look at a supply chain perspective called the invention of the ocean container, which is really what enabled the ocean carrier business in the first place. Before the 1950s, all ocean cargo was loaded and offloaded from ships in a manual fashion. Known as bulk shipping, as we had referred to previously, men used cargo nets and cranes to hoist all types of cargo on and off vessels. In 1956, a trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean came up with the idea of shipping merchandise in ocean containers, a practice that would save time, reduce costs, and vastly improve shipping economies of scale. Second paragraph. Based on his concept, Mr. McLean purchased a bulk vessel called the Ideal X and retrofitted it to carry an early version of what we now know as ocean containers. The first containerized journey of the Ideal X, which was the first in the world, was in 1956 from Newark, New Jersey to Houston, Texas, and carried 58 containers. In 1961, the ocean container industry took a giant leap forward when global standards were established for container sizes, which we'll be talking about in just a couple of minutes. With globally recognized standards, countries around the world were then able to construct what are called purpose-built ports, which were designed specifically for the handling of container ships. Today, there are more than 20 million containers in use in the global merchant fleet. There's actually about 22 million or so, but certainly north of 20 million. The ocean container, in a very big way, was one of the key variables that enabled globalization. We would not see the globalization of trade at the levels it is today without the ocean container. Simple as that. Let's transition from the steamship lines themselves and talk about these ocean containers, because they are what have really driven the maritime trade, be it Trans-Pacific eastbound to the United States, transatlantic, all around the world. We're going to begin by looking at a standard 20-foot container, sometimes referred to as a dry container because it doesn't carry refrigerated cargo. We're most interested in the dimensions of these containers, and as we see on the right, we have inside length, width, height, etc. We are most interested in the space capacity and the weight capacity of any container, not just a 20-footer. In that sense, if we go down to the bottom, we'll notice two columns. On the left-hand side, figures expressed in the standard system, and on the right-hand side, more applicable to global trade, expressed in the metric system. A 20-footer will hold 1,172 cubic feet, expressed more appropriately as 33.18 cubic meters. That is the unit of measure for ocean containers. We'll talk a lot about cubic meters moving forward. The tare weight is the actual weight of the container itself, of course, very important. But for our purposes as an importer, we're interested in the maximum cargo capacity from a weight perspective, which for a 20-footer is about 48,000 pounds and 21,727 kilos. We mentioned that the key unit of measure for ocean containers, for ocean shipping in general, is the cubic meter. That's true. But another important unit of measure is not just the kilo, but the metric ton. And a metric ton equals 1,000 kilos. We're going to come back to that in the future. It's important to mention it now. As such, we can express the maximum cargo capacity of a 20-footer as about 22 metric tons. 21.727 to be exact. Cubic meters, metric tons, kilos, all important as we continue to talk about ocean shipping. Let's have a look now at a standard 40-foot container. Again, focusing on the space capacity and the maximum cargo capacity and weight of that container. Needless to say, it's 40 feet long. That's kind of the big thing we're most interested in. But also, its capacity, 67.67 cubic meters. Call it 68 cubic meters. The tare weight, which is the actual weight of the container itself, 3,701 kilos. And the maximum cargo weight of 26,780 kilos, which is roughly 27 metric tons. Also important to point out is that the weight capacity of a 40-footer compared to a 20-footer is not double. It's not a situation where if you could fit 10 tons in a 20-footer, you can put 20 tons in a 40-footer. That's not how it works. We see here, for the 40-footer, 26,780 kilos as a maximum cargo capacity of the container. But in the case of a 20-footer, if we were to go back, we'd see it was 21,727 kilos, almost 22 tons. There's not a direct ratio between a 20 and a 40-footer as it relates to weight capacity, cargo capacity of those containers. That's important to mention. Let's move on to a 40-foot high cube container, which gives about a foot of extra height in that container compared to a standard 40-footer. The reason why 40-foot high cube containers are around is because they were built to accommodate voluminous cargo, where the type of cartons that are going into an ocean container contain merchandise that isn't very heavy. It takes up a lot of space, but it doesn't weigh very much. So we want to be able to stuff as much merchandise as we can into a 40-foot high cube without hitting the maximum weight capacity of that high cube container. Really what we need to remember is that high cube containers are best for more voluminous cargo. Cartons of merchandise, as we said, that take up a lot of space, but they don't necessarily weigh very much. We'll be talking more about this idea of weight versus measure, weight versus volume of cargo in the future. For now, 40-foot high cubes were built for voluminous cargo. We can see that extra foot of height gives us 76.3 cubic meters of space, or about 2,700 cubic feet. That extra space is really important to retailers, for example, that import cargo that is voluminous in nature, and they can make really good use of that extra space in the container. Let's also have a look at a 45-foot container, but from a little bit different perspective. We're going to use this image to illustrate a point that we present as a trade tip. The dimensions and weight capacity of a container can be found on the right-hand door of the container itself. While there are standard-sized containers, the 20s, 40s, 45s, etc., the tier weight of a specific container may vary slightly. That tier weight being the actual weight of the container. But as we zoom in on this 45-footer, we can see that right-hand door and see the big advantage of using 45-footers that, again, can accommodate a lot of voluminous cargo. You can put a lot of stuff in there before you reach the weight capacity of the container itself. For example, 86 cubic meters in a 45-footer, or the equivalent of around 3,000 cubic feet. More importantly, with a weight capacity of 60,000 pounds. Needless to say, there's an additional charge to enjoy the benefit of a bigger container, but they're definitely in play and something that U.S. importers need to think about as they consider what type of containers they're going to use for their imports. That will wrap up Section 7. When we come back, we'll talk about the growth in the size of container ships. Pretty amazing what's gone on since the 1950s. Please do return quickly.